I see a green light, so I take it that's a good thing. All right. So welcome back. We are, well, I still call it Sunday school, but I guess we are investigate time. So I'm continuing my series on the history of the Hebrews. I was up here about a month ago. Does anybody remember where we left off? Because I did a full review of everything I had done the year before. We are in Genesis. Yes. Good job, Megan. As a reward, you get a cinnamon bun before you leave. We were talking about Jacob. That's where we'd spent the entire year working up to a certain point in Jacob's life, which is where we ended. Does anybody remember what had just happened? Adam's trying, he's making some faces. Okay, we did have the reunification of Jacob and Esau, but they had they had just camped near a little town called Shechem. Yep. So, physically, Jacob was still around the area of Shechem. This is where, well, where's my clicker? Here we go. Let's step back just a little bit. So where we had left him this was his family at this point. He has 11 sons and at least one daughter. Diana was the subject of the most recent event. She was taken by Shechem forcefully in a sexual sense, and there we go. Simeon and Levi, they were the ones that decided to avenge their sister. So they ended up killing everybody in the town, all the other brothers. They didn't do the killing, but what did they do? They just looted the town and took everything, with them. This created likely some very bad feelings in the surrounding area with all the other towns. They were a little afraid. So Jacob and family was a little bit afraid of what was going to happen. There's actually a decent thought that maybe the other towns did gang up on him and attack the group, and Jacob prevailed. We'll get to that several chapters, but that's a thought. Either way, God tells Jacob, hey, it is time for you to leave Shechem. And go to Bethel. Here we go. So we're going Shechem, he's going a little bit south, and he's going back to Bethel. Before he leaves, does anybody remember what Jacob told the group to give to him? All of their little g gods, all of their idols. Who had at least a couple of these? His wife, Rachel. Remember, she had stole some from the house of Laban. So he takes them, he buries them under a tree. I think, and I mentioned this last time, this is Jacob's spiritual low point of his life. He left his family. He gets to talk to God that first night. This is Jacob's ladder. He sees the angels. God makes him some promises about he's going to take care of him. He's going to return him to the land of Canaan. And he's going to bless him. From that point, he goes. God works amazing things over the next 20-some years. Jacob has returned back to Canaan. God has fulfilled his promises. But what has Jacob's sons just done? A very terrible act. Jacob realizes that spiritually he's not where he needs to be. And I think it realizes all of a sudden, I have not been a spiritual leader, a spiritual father to my family. I think this is Jacob's rock bottom point spiritually. So he takes all these little g gods, he buries them under a tree. I think this is his attempt to kind of purify the group. He's trying to make up for lost time. He's trying to take these outside influences, these idols, these things that are the opposite of God, and he's trying to do away with them, get them out of the group, and he buries them under a tree. I think a stronger action would have been, hey, let's burn them. Just a thought. But he buries them under a tree, and then he continues on to Bethel. So that's where we left off. So we are in Genesis 35. If you want to turn to that, just to have it, we'll be going through a few verses here and there. Were there any comments, questions, thoughts from anything else we had talked about up to this point? Okay, no. So once Jacob gets to Bethel, God appears again to him. We're in verses 10 and 12. God says to him, "Your name is Jacob. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. Thus he called him Israel. God also said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come forth from you. The land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you. Now, God already changed Jacob's name to Israel. Remember that night he wrestled with him on the other side of the river before he met Esau? So did God forget what he had done? No, I mean, there's sometimes when I go, I got to go do that, and then I realize I already did it. I mean, I have those moments. You think God had one of these forgetful moments? No. So why? Why did he say this again? Exactly. I think this was God's way of reminding Jacob, God's feelings towards Jacob. Because what does Israel mean? Remember that? Prince of God, or one powerful with God. Do you think Jacob at his spiritual low point needs to be reminded of God's love and God's favor towards him? Hey, you've messed up, but I still love you. You are still my chosen vessel. Do you think that had a little bit of encouragement to Jacob? I have no doubt, and I think that's why God says this again. Now, God also tells him to be fruitful and multiply. Has he already done that? Yes. He's got 4 wives and at least 12 kids at this point. He's already gone down that road pretty strong. But up to this point, God, when we've been talking about the promise is the key of Genesis, starting with Abraham. But up to this point, God has made that promise through an individual son. Remember, Isaac for Abraham, Jacob for Isaac. God is telling Jacob that it's time for that promise to be expanded. That promise needs to grow, and it's going to grow into a nation, and that nation is going to live in the land that God promised to Abraham. So the promise has been gone from person to person. Now, hey, it's time for it to branch out. Time for that promise to grow. We're going to grow into a great nation after this. So we always say things like the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. But we never go any farther. Why does it stop? Because at that point, the promise is no longer confined to one person. It now goes from an individual promise into a promise of a group and the promise of an eventual nation. So Jacob, he sets up a pillar, he pours out a drink offering to God, then he and his house leave Bethel and they go to Bethlehem. So they're going a little bit farther south. Anything important happen in Bethlehem in the future? A little bit. All right, Rachel is apparently pregnant again because on the way to Bethlehem, she gives birth to her second son. Now, unfortunately, there are complications with the birth, and Rachel dies right after the birth of her second son. Now, immediately before she passes away, she names him Ben-Oni. That's the name. You are called Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. Rachel knows that she's dying, so she names her son, son of my sorrow. Now, this was the woman that Jacob loved the most, so how do you think he took that loss? I mean, he had worked 7 years for this woman. Leah had gotten slipped in. He didn't actually get her, so he worked another 7 years. He worked 14 years of hard labor for this woman because he loved her so much. Anybody work 14 years for your wife? Anybody work 14 years since you married your wife? Okay. This had to hurt him deeply. However, this is where Jacob shows, I think, amazing strength. Because he could have easily felt the death was the baby's fault. I mean, she died in childbirth. Something went happen. If she had not been pregnant and had that child, would she have continued to live? Probably. He could have felt that it was the baby's fault and immediately started resenting him. I mean, would anybody feel that way? This little infant took away the woman I love. the name son of my sorrow would have been an appropriate name. If Jacob had kept saying, you are certainly Ben-Oni, and called him Ben-Oni for his entire life, how would that have affected the kid? You think he would have grown up with a complex? Absolutely. The bitterness every time Jacob looked at him, I think would have eaten them both alive. And he would have been reminded every time of the pain and the loss every time he said Ben-Oni. That's my personal feeling. The child would have been an outcast. He would have been unloved. So Jacob changes the name from Ben-Oni to what? Benjamin. Sounds pretty similar, but the meaning is completely different. Benjamin is translated as son of my strength, or son of my happiness or good fortune. Son of my happiness, son of my sorrow. They're complete opposites. Remember, this kid took away the woman he loved, but he's calling him son of my happiness. So instead of feeling resentment, Jacob goes completely the opposite way to recognize that Benjamin is special. He is the last connection that Jacob has to his loving wife. So the story here, which we kind of overlook, it's only a couple verses, I really think that could be a whole New Testament sermon in himself, just this little text. I mean, when we're faced with difficult situations, do we focus on the hurt, or do we allow ourselves to see an opportunity to be thankful for what God has given to us or what God has taught to us in that situation? But this isn't an New Testament lesson. This is an Old Testament lesson. We're going to skip back by, but if anybody wants to do a sermon on it later, you got a good text right here. Just saying. Okay, we now have the completed family tree of Jacob. Who did we add? Benjamin, right here. Joseph's full brother. This brings up an interesting question that we're not going to answer, but we're going to talk about. Did Jacob have more daughters? Now, what are the odds when a couple has a child, it's going to be male or female? Pretty much 50-50. I know women say they got 51% versus 49, whatever, but it's pretty much an even split of what it's going to be. So for Jacob to have 12 sons and 1 daughter, is that a little bit unusual? Sounds that way. Well, we got to remember, God's involved. Could that have happened? Absolutely. There's a couple references later in the Bible, one of which talking when Jacob moved to Egypt, they list his descendants and he calls specifically out Dinah. There's also a reference later that he was mourned by his sons and his daughters. Is daughters referring to daughters-in-law? Is it referring to women of the camp? Don't know. Does it really affect the biblical narrative if he had more daughters? Does it affect it if he had no more daughters? No, it doesn't. All we know is what the Bible says, so that's what we have to stand on and be silent everywhere else. We know he had 12 sons. We know he had 1 daughter. Could he have had more because Diana had such a large role in the story? So that's the only reason she's called out? Maybe. Don't know. Doesn't matter. I'm moving on, unless anybody has any other thoughts or comments. Okay, just wanted to bring that up. So Jacob, he buries Rachel and he sets a pillar over her grave. So like every other place in the, quote unquote, Holy Land, someone in the future went and built a structure over it and started charging admission for tourists. I mean, accepting donations from religious pilgrims. That's the appropriate version. Okay. This is where people in the past used to travel to. This was called Rachel's grave. She was buried in the ground. This is not a tomb that she was put in or, that she rested in. This was just built over the spot where they thought she was buried. So in the past, this was the place people visited. What's that place look like today? A little bit different. Yeah, the actual, that structure has been expanded and really kind of continues down through here. What's this? A gigantic wall around the territory of Israel. Yeah. it's changed quite a little bit. This is still a popular place on most, quote unquote, Holy Land tours, but it is takes them right to the edge of Israel's territory, and there are a lot of heavily armed people right around that building. Looks a little bit different than what it used to, and not really a place I want to go. After Rachel's death, the group continues on to Bethlehem, and in verse 22, we get, "It came about while Israel was dwelling in that land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it." You have this one simple verse. So let's look at the family tree again. I keep pointing the wrong, there we go. Let's go back one. All right, I'll let you do it this time. There we go. All right, let's look at this family tree again. Reuben is whose son? Who did he have this encounter with? His mother's servant, who became his, I don't even know what that family relation would be. This is not a case, though, of incest. This is a case of Reuben laying with his father's wife. Now, we remember that Jacob's his firstborn. We don't know if this was consensual activity or not. Regardless, Jacob eventually finds out, but there's no repercussions until you get to Genesis 49, which we will talk about at a future point. Jacob apparently doesn't do anything with it right now. So was it a consensual act? Don't really know. Was it something else? Not sure. Why did he do this? We don't know the answer. Could it have been love? Probably not, since it seems to be a one-time event. Reuben, personal opinion, I think he took this as a kind of a power move, kind of a power grab. So to claim a ruler's wives or concubines in this period through intimacy was to put yourself in that ruler's place. So we have this demonstrated very well over in 2 Samuel 16, where Absalom, once he took over Jerusalem and David fled, actually had a tent pitched on the roof of the palace where he performed this act in front of the entire city as a way to show, I am now king, to prove that I have my father's wives and concubines. They are now mine, which means I am king. This is not a good time in history. People did bad things. They still do them today. But that was one way of putting yourself in that position of power and taking over that ruler's position. Was this what Reuben intended? Could have been. Not sure why, because what is Reuben's status in the family already? He's number one. That means he is the one that is going to have the power of the family. He's going to rule the family. He's got the birthright. He's got the double portion of the possessions. He's sitting in the catbird seat already. So why would he do this? Don't really know. But it happened because the Bible tells us it did. But it's amazing, this one event, a terrible event as it was, has repercussions for him and his descendants after him, which we'll eventually get to. But this is why I really like the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament we learn about consequences. Our actions have consequences, and they can only be actions that take a split second. Like I literally remember when I was playing basketball, there was a time, my junior, senior year, I got the ball. There was one person in front of me. I could have either taken the jump shot or gone in for a layup. I went in for the layup. We collided. I went down to the ground, landed on my arm. For the next 2 weeks, I was sitting on the sidelines in a sling. It was literally a split-second decision of what I was going to do. Now, that's an entirely different scenario than what Reuben did. But just in that little simple moment, those consequences affected me for the next several weeks, just trying to get my strength back. Have we ever done that? The actions that we take, the decisions that we make, can have long-lasting consequences later. We need to be reminded of that. That's why I like the Old Testament, because it really kind of hits that. I think it's even worse now. I will go on my soapbox here a little bit. I think it's so easy for us in our age to hit the restart button. Why is this? Video games. What happens when you die? Oh, restart. I've already got 12 lives saved. It's so easy. How about people's marriages? Now, there are some marriages that cannot be saved, and there are biblical reasons for a split. But how many people today easily hit the restart button on a marriage because they don't want to put that time and effort into it? I mean, the divorce rate is amazing. People just think, restart. Every one of those decisions, not just that, but through our lives, have consequences. All right, that was my soapbox. I'm stepping off. Genesis 35 continues with a complete list of Jacob's sons and then states that Jacob came to his father Isaac at Hebron. There we go. So he had gradually been working south. He was at Shechem, then he was at Bethel, to Bethlehem. Now he's come to Hebron. It's likely that Esau was still with his father, remember his brother Esau, at least part of the time. We know that Jacob and Esau were both well off. Jacob, we knew what he had lots of animals, lots of possessions. We know that Esau did as well. He had at least 500 animals from Jacob. Remember, he got as a bribe. But he also had large herds himself. So, why would these two groups come together? We've already heard what happens when you have large groups of animals together. What is the other example? Who are the two people that caused friction when they had large animals? Abraham and Lot. Remember, they had to split and go their separate ways. So why would these two groups come together? Let's go to verses 28 and 29. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. Isaac breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people, an old man of ripe age, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Do we know anything about where he's buried? Not from these verses, but eventually we'll learn that he was buried in the cave of Machpelah, kind of the family mausoleum, so to speak. So they were around the field of Machpelah and they buried him there. So we know that Sarah, Abraham, Rebekah, and Isaac are all buried in that same place. Will that be all? There's going to be more. We'll get to that eventually. Note who buries Isaac. Jacob and Esau. Were these two always the best of friends? No. In fact, do we remember Esau's feelings right after Jacob stole Esau's blessing? Let's read it again just for emphasis. So Esau bore a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing of which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are near, then I will kill my brother Jacob." Remember, they thought that Isaac was dying well before. Now he's actually died, and they're both standing there over his body. Do you think Esau thought about it? I don't know. Do you think Jacob thought about it? I would have been a little bit scared. I'll stand over here while we look at the body. Either way, they both bury him together. Esau behaves themselves, and it shows that I think they've both grown up at this point. Now, they're also both around 130 years old, so you would think they would be mature at this point. You never know, though. They bury their father together. Does this remind you of anything else? Two sons that don't get along very well, burying their father? How about Abraham? Who buried Abraham? Isaac and Ishmael. Did those two have a great relationship? Not really, but they also both buried their father together. Now, was this a purely sentimental reason that they came together to do this? Probably not, because what happens at a death? When a person owns stuff, there's a reading of the will and that stuff gets divided. If you're there, you get your portion. If not, I don't know what happens, but you probably want to be there. So At least they behaved themselves, whether they had sentimental feelings to each other or not, but they both buried their father. This sets the stage for Genesis 36. Now, Genesis 36 is entirely about Esau. And we've already know a lot about Esau up to this point, but there is an entire chapter of Genesis devoted to Esau. How much do we know about most of the apostles? We know a name. Maybe one act, maybe two acts. Now, we know a lot about Peter, James, and John, some of the prominent apostles. How about the other ones? What happened to them? We know something from biblical history, but the Bible really doesn't say that much about them. It devotes an entire chapter to Esau. Now, how many people have read Genesis 36 recently? It's a list of names. Honestly, I skip over that chapter quite often. I'm guessing you guys do as well, but there's a couple things that we can learn from it, so I will spend a few minutes with it. If you want to, you can just take a nap, but we're going to go through it. It starts out with a listing of wives and sons. Do we know anything about Esau's wives up to this point? We've talked about them in some previous lessons. We know a little bit. Let's walk through a few things. Whoa! Can we go back to where we were? All right. Yeah. We're doing the opposite of Adam Snow. We're going to go through it lightning speed. So I had to take it down. All right. Turn at Genesis 26:34. Ah, there we go. Genesis 36:44, something we've already talked about. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the wife of Beri the Hittite. So we already know he had a wife. All right, let's go to the next one. Same verse. When Esau was 40 years old, he married, no, that is the same verse. Oh, there, okay. And he also married Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. When did he marry these two? Before Jacob went away, because what was the feelings of Rebekah? What's the Bible say? They brought grief because he married two local women, people that were outside of their clan, their family group. This was the pretense that Rebekah used to send Jacob away. Remember? Because he married these two. I don't want my son to marry another local woman like Esau did. So that's how Jacob went. What happened after he went away? Let's go to the next slide. There we go. And Esau went to Ishmael and married, besides the wives that he had, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son. Right after Jacob went away, what did he do? He went out and married another local woman just to tick off his parents. So we already knew that he had three wives at this point. We've already talked about that. You got Judith, Basemath, and Mahalath. Now let's look at Genesis 36, verses 2 and 3. Esau took his wives from the daughters of Canaan, Adath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, Aholibamath, the daughter of Anath, the granddaughter of Zibeon the Hittite, and Basemath, Ishmael's daughter, the sister of Neboloth. What's the difference? The names don't match. You got Judith, Basemath, Mahalath on one side. Then you have Genesis 36, which is Adath, Aholibamath, and Basemath. The Bible's just a contradiction. Let's throw it out. Do we want to stop at that point, or do we actually want to know what the difference is? I wanted to know what the difference was, so that's why I continued studying. First of all, the wives in chapters 26 and 28, which we had read earlier, they're chronological. The focus of the wives in verses 2 through 5 of 36 is offspring. 36 is a genealogical record of Esau. So the listing is prioritized by importance, either who had kids first or their importance. So the first wife mentioned in chapter 36 is Adath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. Looking back at 26, we see that the name of the daughter Elon is Basemath. So already you've got Adath, which the connection is here. It's the daughter of the same person, so it has to be the same daughter. Why are the names different? The woman is not a Hebrew. She's not. She is a Hittite. And remember, the book of Genesis was written by who? Moses, some 500 years after this event. Moses was a Hebrew, and who did he write the book to? Fellow Hebrews. This woman is not a Hebrew. She had an entirely different name. Both Adath and Basemath are Hebrew names which actually mean ornament and sweet-scented. This is a term of endearment, very similar to what you would call your wife sweetheart, honey. Maybe her name didn't exactly translate well into Hebrew, so he just used her pet name, so to speak, of, hey, sweetheart. That's what both of those names, Adath and Basemath, mean. She's probably listed first in Genesis 36 because it's likely that she had Esau's first son. So your first male offspring, that's a pretty important ranking in this culture in this day and age. The second wife mentioned in chapter 36 is Aholibamath. I love Aholibamath. Like the only other name better is Chedorlaomer. Like that is a great Old Testament name, Chedorlaomer. Just because can hear his parents, hey Cheater, Cheater. Okay. So Aholibamath, it's a great name. She's the daughter of Anath, the daughter of Zibeon the Hittite. We don't see that name mentioned previously, so it's likely that she was Esau's fourth wife. It's likely he had four. We've got two that overlap in this list and one on each side that don't. Excuse me. Okay. There's also, apparently the only difference between the words, you also note difference Horite versus Hivite. Hivite versus Horite in those two verses. The only difference is one little tick of a pencil in the Hebrew language. It's one little tick, changes Hivite to Horite. So it's likely we're also still talking about the same person. Why is this important? Where did the Horites live? In a place that will eventually be called Edom. Does this have any significance to Esau from what we remember? It does. We'll find out. The Horites lived down in here, so it's likely that Esau's fourth wife was taken from around the land of Edom, also called the land of Seir. We know that Esau eventually moved down to Seir. Do we ever recall talking about that land earlier in our study? After Jacob and Esau were reunited, where did Jacob go? I'm sorry, did Esau go? To Seir, because Jacob said, I will meet you down there. Jacob didn't get there because he was hurt hard more than what he thought, and eventually they reconnected somewhere else. But we know that Esau had spent some time down in Seir. It's likely that he met Aholibamath when he was down there and took her as his fourth wife. Verse 29 says that Aholibamath's grandfather and father were both chiefs of the Horites. Esau marrying Aholibamath would have given him rights to the land that he will eventually move to. Now bear with me, there is a point to all this. Let's go back. Next one. Next one. Oh, there we go. All right, so let's go back to our list. The third wife mentioned in 36 is Basemath, Ishmael's daughter. Looking back at chapter 26, we see that the name of Ishmael's daughter is Mahalath. But what does Basemath mean? Sweetheart, honey, ornamental, sweetness. It's a term of endearment. It's not the actual name because her name is something completely foreign to the Hebrews. So, Basemath is Ishmael's daughter. There's one woman from chapter 26 that's not listed in 36, and that is Judith, daughter of Beri the Hittite. She was probably Esau's first wife, and it's thought that she didn't have any children. And that's why she's not listed in chapter 36, which is the genealogical record, the list of the descendants of Esau. If she didn't have any children, or at least not sons, it's very possible that she would not have been included in that list. All right, so what likely happened? Esau's wives, in order. First of all, it's likely that he married Judith, didn't have any children. He'd also married the daughter of Elon the Hittite, either Basemath or Adath. They had sons. Then to make his parents mad, he went after Jacob went away to Haran, Esau marries Ishmael's daughter, wouldn't fit, so I put in kid. He then marries a Horite princess while Jacob is away as a political alliance. So those are likely the 4 wives of Esau. This would explain the difference between, if you look at chapter 36 and actually read it, the wives are listed in different orders there too. One's in order of importance, first wife to have a son, second, political alliance, third, other wife and sons, whereas the other is order of having children. It's second wife, third wife, fourth wife, and then probably the wife that didn't have sons. So if you really want to get into it, it is interesting. I'm trying to go a high level here, but there is a reason, because it probably seems like I spent way too much time on this subject that is completely irrelevant to Jesus and all the important things in the New Testament. However, once you dig into this, what is apparently a contradiction in the Bible, things fit absolutely perfect. There is a great reason why these names would have been different and why the orders would have been different on Esau's wives. Should we care? I don't know. But again, there's an entire chapter in the Bible related to Esau and his wives and sons. Probably worth us spending 10 minutes of an investigate class time looking at. So, hopefully I didn't bore you too much. All right, after we see, if you look at that now that we know the wives, you see that Esau decides to take his family and his numerous possessions. They move out of Canaan and away from Jacob. Why would they have moved away from Jacob? Let's look at the next verse. We find out in Genesis 36, verse 7, for their property had become too great for them to live together, and the land where they sojourned could not sustain them because of their livestock. After the death of their father, they decide to part ways. Esau goes down to Seir/Edom to get away from, so they've got more pasture land, lays areas for their livestock to live in. But do you think there was another reason? He probably wanted to get away from Jacob too. It's just a thought. What happens to all of the stuff that Isaac had? It gets separated between his 2 sons. Esau was the firstborn, so traditionally he would have gotten twice as much, but through the selling of the birthright, he should have only gotten a third, because remember the oldest gets twice as much as, he gets 2 parts for every 1 part of the others. Esau is still going to get a very sizable inheritance from his father, even if it is only a single portion. But he doesn't want to stay part of the family unit because technically, after selling the birthright, who was the head of the family? Jacob, the younger brother. Remember, Esau's the manly man, the outdoorsman, the might is right type person. Jacob is the weak underling, so the Bible says. But Jacob now is over Esau. He can technically control everything that he does. Does Esau want to be part of this? I really don't think so. So he has a connection where? In Seir, through the marriage of his 4th wife. His 4th wife is a princess. This gives Esau an entitlement to the land, and he takes advantage of it. Okay. Continuing through, you also see through the genealogy there that Esau's sons, once he moves to Seir, are listed as chiefs. They're listed as chiefs or rulers. Esau's wives weren't from ruling lines other than Oholibamah. And Esau, it seems, through his marriage, he wasn't just any chief. He arrived in land and became one of, if not the main chief, the main ruler of the entire civilization in that area. Remember, he met Jacob with how many men? 400 heavily armed men. So Jacob has a lot of stuff. He's got a private army to himself, and he has a political connection to the rulers of the land, and he takes advantage of it by going to Seir. Eventually, the place becomes called Edom, which is another name for Esau, home of the Edomites, and this is the important part, this is why I went through all of this the past 15 minutes. This fulfills the words that Isaac said to Esau after Jacob stole Esau's blessings. All right, let's see if this works. Next one, there we go. Then Isaac, his father, had answered to him. This is after Esau comes in and says, you did what to my blessing? You gave it to Jacob? Isaac had words for Esau. Then Isaac, his father, answered to him, behold, away from the fertility of the earth shall be your dwelling, and away from the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and your brother you will serve. But it shall come about when you become restless that you will break his yoke from your neck. This was the prophecy that Isaac made years, decades in advance. Did it come true? Every verse of this. And I'll spend a couple minutes. So Esau is moving to a land, hit it for me, there you go. That is an absolute desert. All right, this is us. If you look at just a satellite image, this is nice and green. We have rivers and mountains and trees and all that stuff. This is the land of Edom. Do you see any speck of green there whatsoever? No, none at all. This is the land that, there we go, that he moved to. So does this fit away from the fertility of the earth and away from the dew of heaven? Absolutely. Check. We got that prophecy fulfilled. Now this area will eventually become, a great civilization. I'll talk about that in a second. But let's check the other ones. By your sword you shall live. We know he had at least 400 armed men, and he went down here into Edom. He had a claim to the throne, but if he had just walked in there with his wife, do you think everybody else who had a claim to the throne would have just stepped aside? Oh, sure, you can rule over us. It's likely his private little army helped. He lived by the sword. We know he had this group of men that were loyal to him and that could fight for him. And your brother you shall serve. What happened immediately after Isaac died? Jacob's now in charge. So even though a short period of time, Esau was in servitude to Jacob. Check 3. How about the last one? But you, when you become restless, will break his yoke from your neck. The yoke, it's a symbol of being a servant, being submissive to something else, just like an animal. The driver is in charge of the animal. Esau broke the yoke of Jacob. He moved long, long ways away and completely severed that tie. Check 4. Every single one of the promises that Isaac gave to Esau has now been fulfilled. Isn't the Bible an amazing thing? I think it is. I think this stuff just really hits home of, you can't make this stuff up. It fits together so amazingly well when you look at the Bible, when you look at history, and just combine it. It's exciting to me. I'm getting a lot of blank faces. Like, why don't we talk about Esau for 30 minutes? Still, it's very interesting. Now, also, just back on Edom real quick. The civilization that was founded there, it was carved out of rock in a desert. These people, they were experts in transporting water. They had channels cut for miles and miles and miles, bringing what little bit of water would fall in the winter months in the mountains. They would bring it down and they would store it for literally an entire year through these water channels. Once it got to the city, they had a distribution center of pressurized pipes. This is thousands of years ago, pressurized plumbing, meaning the pipe was lower than where you're getting the water out of, and there was some kind of tap. You could have pressurized plumbing in the desert. They had amazing crops. They were a great trading civilization. Esau didn't see all that come to place, but he's the one that set the civilization up, which again says, I will make them both a great nation. That had been prophesied from their birth. It came true through these people just flat out intelligence, which Esau was a great part of. You also had stuff like This is the city of Petra. If you've studied anything about it, they carved these buildings out of the rock, including this one. Wait for it, wait for it. There we go. Anybody remember this? Okay. Yeah, Last Crusade. This is where it was filmed. Yeah, the Holy Grail's in here. You just gotta go find it. It's actually very disappointing because it's just like a hollowed out room in here that's like 20 foot by 20 foot, and like there's no little cavern and no booby traps and stuff. It's like, yeah. If you actually do the history, it's kind of disappointing after you've seen the movie. But that civilization, I mean, they do stuff like this. You don't build stuff like this if you're scrounging around for food and you're worried about your very first survival. You don't have time to carve stuff out of solid rock. This is the civilization that Esau founded. So I think it's pretty amazing. So Genesis 36 is now over. Esau has moved out of the picture. He has broken the yoke of Jacob. And then Jacob's family will take off in chapter 37, specifically looking at Joseph. The story really focuses on his journey after this. So. Questions, comments? Okay, thanks for bearing with me. I think it's interesting stuff once you actually dig into it. So. Was anyone downstairs this morning that didn't have the opportunity for Lord's Supper? Dan, I don't know if you can do a short version of a couple words.